The Silent Night Miracle, when gunfire stopped for Christmas. A true story of 1914, the frozen fields of Flanders. The year was 1914. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars, a conflict that many politicians and generals promised would be over by Christmas. But as December arrived, the reality was far grim. The Great War, which we now know as World War I, had settled into a brutal stalemate. Across the fields of Flanders in Belgium and parts of France, the earth was scarred by miles of trenches. These were not just ditches, they were muddy, freezing, rat-infested scars on the face of Europe. For the soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force and the German Empire, life had become a living nightmare. The winter of 1914 was exceptionally cold. The temperature dropped well below freezing, turning the mud into rock-hard, jagged peaks, and the pools of water into sheets of ice. Snow began to fall, blanketing the horrific landscape in a deceptive layer of pure white. Imagine being a young man, perhaps only 18 or 19 years old. You are thousands of miles away from home. You are American, British, or German. At the heart of it, you are just a human being who misses his mother's cooking and the warmth of a fireplace. Instead of warmth, you have the biting wind. Instead of family laughter, you have the constant, rhythmic thud of artillery shells landing in the distance. The space between your trench and the enemy's trench is called no man's land. It is a zone of certain death, littered with barbed wire and the frozen bodies of fallen comrades. By Christmas Eve, December 24th, the fighting had been ferocious for months. Hate was fueled by propaganda. Soldiers were told that the men on the other side were monsters, devoid of humanity. But as the sun set on that Christmas Eve, something changed. The weather seemed to sharpen, the frost hardened, and an eerie silence began to descend over the Western Front. It was as if the war itself was taking a breath. A light in the darkness. Private Thomas, a young British soldier, shivered in his greatcoat. He was leaning against the damp clay wall of his trench, trying to keep his feet out of the freezing slush. He pulled a crumpled photograph from his pocket, his parents and his younger sister standing in front of their home in London. Tears welled in his eyes, but they froze before they could fall. He wondered if they were thinking of him at this very moment. He wondered if he would ever see another Christmas. Suddenly, a whisper ran down the line of British soldiers. "Look," someone hissed. "Look at the German lines." Thomas peered cautiously over the parapet, careful not to expose his head to a sniper. What he saw confused him. Along the rim of the German trenches, small lights were appearing. One by one, flickering flames danced in the dark. "Are they preparing an attack?" a sergeant muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. But these were not muzzle flashes of guns. They were candles. The Germans were placing small Christmas trees, lit with candles, along the edge of their trenches. In the pitch black of the war zone, it looked like a string of stars had fallen to earth. Then, the sound drifted across no man's land. It wasn't a scream or a command. It was a melody. Deep, baritone voices began to sing in unison. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." Thomas didn't speak German, but he knew the tune. Every Christian in the world knew that tune. It was Silent Night. The British soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. The enemy was clapping. Voices across the void. Emboldened by the singing, a shout came from the German darkness. In broken English, a voice called out, "You no shoot, we no shoot." It was a simple proposition, a truce, not authorized by generals, not signed by kings or emperors, but offered by freezing men who just wanted one night of peace. "Come out," another voice yelled. "English soldier, come out." The British officers were nervous. "It's a trap," the captain warned. "Keep your heads down." But the spirit of the moment was stronger than military discipline. One British soldier, perhaps braver or more desperate than the rest, climbed up the ladder. He stood in full view on top of the trench, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. "Don't shoot," he shouted. From the fog on the other side, a German silhouette appeared. He too was unarmed. They began to walk toward each other. The mud crunched under their boots. Every eye in both trenches watched them. If a single shot rang out, the massacre would resume. They met in the middle of no man's land. They hesitated for a second, then reached out and shook hands. That handshake shattered the illusion of the war. Suddenly, dozens, then hundreds of soldiers began climbing out of their holes. Gray coats mixed with khaki coats. Men who had been trying to kill each other hours ago were now standing face to face, not with bayonets, but with curiosity. The gift of humanity. The scene in no man's land was surreal. The moon was bright, illuminating a gathering that history would never forget. The soldiers didn't speak the same language, but they communicated through signs, smiles, and the universal language of Christmas. They began to exchange gifts. These were not expensive presents wrapped in ribbons. They were the treasures of the trenches. A British soldier offered a tin of bully beef. A German soldier traded a box of cigars. Buttons were cut off uniforms and swapped as souvenirs. Chocolate bars, jams, and even alcohol were shared. Thomas found himself standing in front of a German soldier named Hans. Hans looked just as young and tired as Thomas. Hans pulled out a picture of his family in Munich. Thomas showed him the picture of his family in London. They looked at the pictures, then at each other, and nodded. In that moment, the propaganda dissolved. Hans wasn't a monster. He was a son, a brother, a human being stuck in the same hell as Thomas. "Merry Christmas," Thomas said. "Fröhliche Weihnachten," Hans replied, smiling. They shared a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind with their cupped hands. For a few hours, the war didn't exist. There were no allies, no central powers. There were only men. The game that stopped the war. As the morning of Christmas Day broke, the fog lifted slightly. The truce had held through the night. The sun rose on a bizarre sight. No Man's Land, usually a place of death, was filled with groups of men talking and laughing. Then something legendary happened. Someone kicked a ball out from the trenches. History is debated on exactly where the ball came from. Some say it was a proper leather football. Others say it was a tin can or a bundle of rags tied together with string. But it didn't matter. "Football!" someone shouted. The game began. It was perhaps the strangest soccer match ever played. There were no referees, no goalposts, and certainly no rules. The pitch was frozen mud, filled with shell craters. The players were wearing heavy military boots and thick coats. There were maybe 50 players on each side, running after the ball, slipping on the ice, laughing as they fell. For the Americans reading this, imagine the sheer absurdity and beauty of it. These men were trained to hate. They were armed to kill. Yet here they were, cheering when the enemy scored a goal. It wasn't about winning. It was about the joy of playing. It was a reclaiming of their stolen youth. One German soldier later wrote in his diary, "It was marvelous, like a dream. The English are not like we were told." A British major noted, "I never thought to see such a sight. It is a triumph of the human spirit." The score of that match has been lost to history. Some say the Germans won 3-2, others say it was a draw, but the result was irrelevant. The real victory was that for one glorious day, humanity defeated politics. The roar of the crowd wasn't for blood, it was for sport. A somber duty. Amidst the celebration, there was also a moment of shared sorrow. The truce allowed both sides to perform a grim but necessary duty. Scattered across no man's land were the bodies of soldiers who had fallen in the attacks leading up to Christmas. Until now, it had been too dangerous to retrieve them. Together, British and German soldiers gathered their dead. They helped each other dig graves in the frozen earth. In a moment of profound respect, they stood side by side for a joint burial service. A British chaplain read the 23rd Psalm in English, "The Lord is my shepherd." A German divinity student read it in German, "Der Herr ist mein Hirte." Enemies stood together, heads bowed, mourning the friends they had lost. They realized that the grief of a German mother was no different from the grief of a British mother. The tears shed were the same salt. This shared act of mourning cemented the bond between them. It showed that dignity could exist even in the slaughterhouse of war. The general's fury. As the sun began to set on Christmas Day, the reality of their situation began to creep back in. The truce had happened spontaneously, driven by the soldiers on the ground, the rank and file. The high command, the generals sitting in comfortable chateaus miles away from the front, were furious when they heard the news. Orders were issued immediately. Fraternization with the enemy is strictly forbidden. Treason. Any soldier found speaking to the enemy will be court-martialed. The generals knew a dangerous truth. If the soldiers realized that the enemy was just like them, they would refuse to fight. War relies on dehumanization. The Christmas truce threatened the entire machinery of the war. Slowly, reluctantly, the men returned to their respective trenches. The handshakes were final. The exchanges of good luck were heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow they might have to shoot the man they just shared a drink with. Thomas shook Hans' hand one last time. "Take care, friend," Thomas said. "You too," Hans replied softly. "Pray for peace." The return to reality. The silence returned to the trenches, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of sadness. In some sectors, the truce lasted until New Year's Day. In others, the artillery began firing the very next morning. But many soldiers fired high, aiming over the heads of the men they had met, refusing to kill their new friends. It took weeks for the commanders to rotate fresh troops in, troops who hadn't played football or sung carols, to get the war fully restarted. The war would drag on for 4 more bloody years. Millions more would die. Thomas and Hans may have survived, or they may have become 2 more names on the stone monument. We do not know. What we can learn today. Why does this story matter to us, the US audience, more than a century later? We live in a world that is often divided. We are divided by politics, by ideology, by borders, and by beliefs. Social media algorithms feed us propaganda about those who disagree with us, telling us they are the enemy, that they are devoid of reason or kindness. The Christmas truce of 1914 teaches us a powerful lesson. It teaches us that the things that unite us are far stronger than the things that divide us. Underneath the uniforms, the flags, and the labels, we all want the same things: safety for our families, a warm meal, a little bit of joy, and peace. It teaches us that even in the darkest of times, light can be found. It wasn't a government treaty that stopped the war that Christmas. It was the courage of ordinary individuals. It was the courage to sing, the courage to stand up, and the courage to extend a hand instead of pulling a trigger. The Christmas truce was a miracle, but it wasn't magic. It was a choice made by ordinary people to be human, and that is a choice we can make every single day. Merry Christmas to you all, and may we always choose peace.